So, welcome everybody to the first session of the afternoon and the second one to be finished the first day. So, this talk is TLP wide, so you can take pictures and all that stuff. Please remember, if you have any questions after the talk, we have a microphone in the aisles, so please line up at the microphones. There's also a survey, so if you have the official first app, please fill out the survey for the speakers after the talk. If you have any devices that can make noises or disturb the speakers, please be so kind and turn them off. Good, and now we'll see a talk by two speakers. The first speaker is Kellyn. She's a senior cyber threat intelligence analyst at MITRE. And the second speaker is Mike, who is a lead cyber operations engineer also at MITRE. And they're going to talk about the Sightings Ecosystem, which is a community-driven effort to track attack tactics seen in the wild, and also a good example of what the cybersecurity community can accomplish when we all work together in the public interest. So give them a warm round of applause, and let's start with the talk.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to Sightings Ecosystem, a data-driven analysis of attack in the wild.
Good afternoon. My name is Kellyn Wagner Ramsdell. I'm a lead cyber threat intelligence analyst at MITRE, where I also support the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, who sponsored and led the research we're going to be talking about today. I've been with MITRE for a little over a year, but I spent most of my career in state and local government in the United States, where I was responding and investigating all crimes involving computers, so that's everything from ransomware to gas pump skimmers. I am married. My husband Rob and I, we live in the DC area in the United States with our dog Pete.
My name is Mike Cunningham. I'm the R&D program manager at the Center for Threat-Informed Defense. I've been at MITRE a little over 5 years, and before that I was an interactive botnet operator at the NSA. I live in sunny San Diego with my wife Amy. We have 3 daughters, and we have a golden doodle named Sunny. And as Kellyn mentioned, the Center for Threat-Informed Defense was the main sponsor for this research effort. The center is a privately funded research and development center that partners with private industry to solve difficult problems. So we bring together some of the best security teams in the world. We compare that with MITRE's objective research abilities, and we solve problems to help advance the state of the art for threat-informed defense and the state of practice. And one of those, and our citing participants, our main research collaborators for this effort was ATT&CK, HCA Healthcare, Fortinet, the Global Security Alliance, and Verizon. And along with that, we had data contributors from Red Canary, ConnectWise, and First Energy, and some other unnamed partners. Now, a problem that we noticed was that defenders lack visibility into adversary behaviors. So we have this awesome resource, which is ATT&CK, which tries to capture all adversary behavior that is seen in public reporting. And what ATT&CK is not meant to do is be a day-to-day analysis of what defenders are actually doing. In order to get some insight into what adversaries are actually doing, we can turn to CTI Reporting.
Now, CTI Reporting has a lot of benefits. It can provide us valuable information on adversaries. It discusses novel techniques when we see adversaries change their tradecraft or innovate new techniques. It's excellent for creating adversary profiles. We can take that information about a specific adversary and their tradecraft, build those profiles by which to inform our detections, our investigations, and even attribution if we do that. ATT&CK itself was built on CTI and public reporting of threat actors. However, when it comes to informing defenders, there are some limitations in CTI reporting. First and foremost, there are various biases that impact reporting. I don't think a CTI conference is complete without talking about biases. So, but we have, first and foremost, when we think of defenders, a novelty bias issue. CTI, when we're producing reports, we have a reporting threshold we have to meet. It has to be justified, because we can't put out a report on every single thing we see. Otherwise, we're inundating and overwhelming our consumers and making our work unhelpful. So we have to pick something to focus, and that often means we write on novelty. There's also a visibility bias. When we produce CTI, are limited by what we can see. So that might be based on where our customers are or what industry our customers are in. It might be based on our sensors or our technology and where we monitor. The end result is me as a CTI analyst producing what I'm seeing in state and local government might not be as useful to someone defending the energy sector in Europe, say. So we have that visibility bias too. There are many other biases. I'm not going to go into all of them. But those biases then lead into this other thing of this question when we look at CTI reporting. Is this content evidence of something pervasive or just a flash in the pan? Are we writing a report about a threat actor's innovative use of steganography? Or are we seeing the standard phishing email with a link and those standard activities associated with Emotet or TrickBot or QuackBot that maybe we don't write on those every time because we see them every day, but we will write about that innovative use of steganography? Then defenders who are consuming it are like, wait, should I look here or should I look at that thing we are seeing all the time? So how do we prioritize based on all of these intricacies of cyber reporting, which is where we went to the Sightings Ecosystem.
So we had this idea to help overcome some of these biases. If we engage the global community to collect and share sightings data, we could hopefully help give a better idea of what's actually happening in the wild. And so what is a sighting? A sighting is one or more attack techniques that have been observed being used by an adversary on or to target victim infrastructure. And a sighting is not a lot of data. It's a JSON file that has technique ID, it has the time it occurred, the operating system, potentially the sector, the region that the sighting was seen. So it's a real small amount of data, but it's also a really powerful bit of data. And so as we go out to the global community and we start crowdsourcing this, we needed to convince the community to work in the public interest. It's difficult to go out and ask these vendors to share their private, sensitive data with us to help us do this research effort where they might not see a dollar-for-dollar return on that effort. But we engaged in a long campaign to connect with a lot of our network, something we're doing here, and find vendors that wanted to share their attack-specific data with us. We also had to convince them that we had a safe way to share these sightings. So as I mentioned, the data they have is very sensitive. Some of these vendors, they don't actually own the data. It's customer data. But we had to make sure that they felt that we were going to be good stewards of the data. We're going to do everything we can to protect that data. So we did some research into differential privacy to ensure that there's no way that if for some reason this data got out, that anyone could be able to reverse engineer and trace it back to either the vendor from which it came or the customers from which that data came. We also wanted to develop a public option for everybody to use. So as we get into the research that was conducted, we had to build a pipeline to process our attack data, to perform the analysis on the data. And we didn't want to keep that for ourselves, because everything we do is working in the public interest. So if there were some companies, organizations that have a lot of data, but they didn't feel comfortable sharing it, we want to be able to provide the tools for them to do their own analysis, their own sightings work, so that way they can see the most common techniques that are taking place within their networks. So once we got all that data, what did we get? We got 6 million different techniques. From with that, we did some normalizations of the data, and we pared that down to 1.1 million usable techniques. We had 184 unique techniques, and the date range from that was between April 2019 and July 2021.
So when we talk about that drop from 6 million to 1.1 million that we analyzed, some of that was in the data cleaning process. I think our original data set, when we just took our raw collection, ranged from 1980 to 2040. So obviously there were some errors there. We had to remove that information. We also did a preliminary frequency analysis where we saw any truly anomalous spikes. There was one technique from one source that just far and above rose the others, and they confirmed that that was an error, so we removed that. And then we were left with those a year and a half, or about a year and a half's worth of data, 1.1 million sightings, and that's 1.1 million observed techniques across 800,000 sightings. Some sightings contain multiple techniques, which will become relevant in a few minutes. And we saw 184 unique techniques and sub-techniques. Our results. They are published in a, I am so sorry for the length, 50-page report. The report is partially that long because we include for every technique in the top list, we include things like links to the Cyber Analytics Repository, to Sigma Analytics, to the United States' National Institute of Standards and Technologies 853 security controls. We directly provide the defense information here, recognizing, hey, our defenders are busy. Let's give a starting point. You don't know where to prioritize. We're saying this list can help you prioritize, and here's what you can do about it. But what data did we actually find? What techniques are we seeing? We were ready. We have this huge MITRE attack framework, and we get our data. 90% of the data was 15 techniques. Now, some of these techniques, sure, we had sub-techniques, but 15 techniques accounted for 90% of the data. Oof, all right. That was surprising to us. We expected to see more. And then we looked further, and over half of our data set was made up of only 3 techniques. I'll talk about which techniques in a second, but there was kind of that question of, all right, what does that reflect about our detections and how well they map to attack? What does that tell us? But we were still able to gain some interesting insights. So when we break out our top 5, because I'm not going to talk through all 15 today, number 1 and number 2, these aren't surprising: scheduled task job and command and scripting interpreter. We know adversaries are using living off the land techniques. They're using those legitimate tools to evade detections. Well, this reflects that. They're using our standard tools. Within scheduled task and job, we saw what you would expect: scheduled task as a sub-technique, but we also saw cron, which to us was a good thing because it meant our data set encompassed both Windows systems and Linux or Mac OS. So we did actually have not just Windows systems presented here. Not a lot, but some. With command and scripting interpreter, the breakdown was what you would expect. We saw a lot of PowerShell. We saw a lot of Windows command shell. Basic stuff. Adversaries are using command line. No one's really surprised there. We then saw hijack execution flow as number 3. And that one, we were a little surprised to see it, but it makes sense. And in fact, when we talk about sub-techniques, most of the observations for this technique was DLL search order hijacking. So we see adversaries use that in a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons. So it makes sense that it's coming in at number 3. Number 4 and 5, all right, proxy and non-application layer protocol. They both come in at 8% of the data set. That'll become relevant again in a few minutes. But again, all right, adversaries are trying to avoid using standard paths, and they're trying to obscure their origin. None of this was outright shocking, but here we have clear proof that adversaries are doing that. So when I mentioned 4 and 5, non-application layer protocol and proxy were both the same amounts. Within this analysis, we did a co-occurrence analysis. So with the sightings data, we sought to identify sequence. How are adversaries using attack techniques in sequence? Because we know if we have sequence, we can start informing better risk-based alerting, we can start doing process mining and learning more about our adversaries' activities. We couldn't get sequence in our sightings, but we could get co-occurrence. So we could see where multiple techniques were used in the same event, and we had some of our contributors were able to link that together. So with that co-occurrence data, we were able to perform association rule mining. It's a data science technique. I'm not going to go super in-depth on it. We can chat afterwards if you're interested in that process. But to identify links where when we see one technique, in excess of 50% of the time, we see the second technique. Well, with proxy and non-application layer protocol, we saw that these two almost always occurred together. That 8%, they were always just right there when the other one was used. Okay, that's helpful. But our main cluster of findings found that command and scripting interpreter is used as a facilitator for most techniques. You can see in this cluster, I know it's kind of small, there's a full report with it, and you can zoom in however you want. But command and scripting interpreter helps and is observed with a lot of other techniques. We see it with masquerading, we see it with obfuscated files or information. So what does that mean? We're doing this work to inform defenders. Does that mean when we build our analytics, we tie command and scripting interpreter to our alert for another technique maybe? So instead of you getting 2 alerts, you get them connected? Or what does it mean for how we form our detections for command and scripting interpreter? There's a lot of options here, depending on your specific risk register, the maturity of your organization, but we can glean some useful insights from this idea of a co-occurrence analysis. I will also highlight we saw one chain of 3 techniques that typically occur together, and that's command and scripting interpreter to impair defenses to indicator removal on host. Again, not surprising, but it is nice to have those things we assumed and those things we thought we knew about adversaries confirmed in the data.
So outside of finding out what are the most common techniques that are happening, what else did we learn? Well, we learned that defense is hard. I don't know if we learned it. I guess it further cemented the idea that defense is hard. I don't think we'd all be at these conferences every year if defense was easy. But what makes it hard? We have defenders that are overworked. When we reached out to many different organizations, the most common rejection we got was, this is great, I really want to contribute, but we don't have the people, the resources to allocate to develop a plugin for our SIEM or to write some sort of script to export from the EDR platform. So they just wanted to help, but they didn't have the resources. They didn't have the money. They were focused on their company's main mission. And our SOCs are also underfunded. So we find oftentimes that the threat intelligence team might be one person. There might be a one-person incident response team. There might be a one-person malware analysis team. And sometimes that's all the same person. And when you're trying to do this community effort of helping out defenders essentially for free, it's hard to convince those people to dedicate extra cycles to this type of effort. And we also want to reiterate that prioritization is critical. You look at the attack matrix here, it's huge. It's about 576 techniques right now, I think. That's a lot to take on, and especially for defenders and teams who don't have a ton of resources, where do they start? If MITRE releases a new technique, are we then telling you guys to go and focus your defenses on this technique, and now you need to write a detection for this technique? Not necessarily, but maybe. I don't know, that's something each organization needs to prioritize. And also, if you're not prioritizing your defenses, you're going to leave yourself with a bunch of blind spots.
So Sightings gives you don't have to look at all 500 techniques if that's not within your realm of possibility. You can start by looking at 15 depending on your risk register again. It's a starting place.
Right. So our solution that we've built, again, we talk about crowdsourcing, we talk about community contributions. We're able to leverage global data from myriad sources to prove out our hypothesis, which was if we all come together, and the motto of this conference this year is strength together. So if we all work together, we can have higher fidelity results. We're able to bring together endpoint vendors, network vendors, MSSPs, email providers, all these different resources that one specific vendor doesn't have access to. We're able to contribute all of that and come up with different results. And one of the things that was interesting that we found was Red Canaries, I mentioned. It was one of our data contributors. Every year they put out a threat incident report, which highlights the top 10 techniques that they have seen. When we compared our list to their list, it was markedly different. We had a lot of the same techniques, scripting, command scripting interpreter, scheduled jobs. We're going to see those, but they were in different orders. And to us, when we bring in these other contributors that have insights into network traffic, that have insights into email traffic, we get different results, and that proves out the hypothesis that we had at the beginning of this research effort. And also developing open source tools, something we're really passionate about at MITRE, and I think that it shows we have a lot of great open source tools that we probably all use. We have Sigma HQ, which is a great analytic repository. We have MISP, that I'm sure a lot of us use. We have these open source projects that have proven to be really effective and really powerful, and we keep building up that toolbox. It's just going to make things a lot more difficult for defenders.
Or adversaries.
For adversaries, also them. Thank you. And then also, crowdsourcing this data allows us to prioritize based off of real-world data. If we just go based off of the most common reports or the newest reports, we might have a different idea of where to prioritize. As Kellyn mentioned earlier, we talk about Emotet, TrickBot, QuackBot. We see that happening a lot, and it does, but how much is a lot? And is it actually happening more than we might see some other specific techniques? And so bringing all the community together, crowdsourcing, it helps us prioritize based off of real-world data.
Yeah, and we didn't just look at the sightings data, which we did, but once we pulled out the detections or the security controls that are most associated with the various techniques we observed in that top 15 list, we did our own little analysis of, hey, what security controls? What are the top 10 that are going to give you the best coverage for these techniques? We don't have them listed here, but again, they're in the report. I mean, they are what we expect. It's identifying adversaries masquerading as legitimate users. But we were able to break that down so we could prioritize and look based on what the data is showing adversaries are doing. But limitations, there were a lot. This was the first effort of taking data from multiple sources, taking large-scale attack data, sightings data. So we encountered some stumbling blocks. And one of those sightings is limited by its contributors. So we knew that going in. We knew, okay, we're saying CTI has a visibility bias. We're saying reporting from a single organization is limited to their visibility. Well, in this report, we had a limited number of contributors. We hoped to get more, but due to various concerns and issues and just being the first round, we had a very small number. That means that this data, it might not be exact to what all industries are seeing or what all regions, or depending on what technology you have in your stack. It might not be exactly applicable to your organization because our visibility was limited. It's not easy being mapped to attack. That's another major limitation within the Sightings ecosystem is we had some contributors who were gung-ho. They were like, yeah, we'd love to do this. Getting data-driven analysis of what adversaries are doing in the wild, great. Wait, we don't map our data to attack. So right there, we couldn't go forward. Then for those organizations that map to attack, there's that question of what techniques can be mapped to attack? Because not all really map well in an automated fashion where we can say, hey, if we observe these specific observables, they're likely associated with this MITRE attack technique. Not all works super well for that. So this data, we can't capture those techniques that are hard to map. We're also probably going to be relying on those detections that are more robust and that have been built in. So we do have a little bit of a detections bias almost in there of, all right, that question of we don't know our unknown unknowns. And so that's obviously still here. But that's maybe where the novelty bias in CTI reporting is helpful to kind of fill in those gaps. But it's not easy to map to attack was one of our hard parts. And then the big limitation I saw as a data analyst was when you're analyzing this data, you learn as much about yourself, if not more, than you do about your enemy. It's that age-old analysis thing of when you're analyzing someone else, you end up saying a lot more about yourself. It was really hard for me to look at our data, to break it down, and be like definitively, adversaries are doing this. Because every time I looked at some set of data, there was that question of, wait, was that the adversary, or was that defenders tweaking a detection? Did they add a new detection? Did they tweak a detection? Maybe it was adversaries finding a way around a detection. Maybe it was us adding things. I couldn't make a meaningful conclusion and say, yes, I have high confidence that the adversaries were doing this because I didn't know what the defenders were doing. Now, to me, I had this realization and I was like, I'm ready to throw in the towel. Like, I can't say anything about adversaries. And I'm pretty sure Mike was ready to vote me off the team because of that, good versus perfect conversation. So I stuck with it, and he stuck with me. And I did find we talk so much about tracking our adversaries and tracking like the concept of change management and tracking our vulnerability management. What are we doing to track our detections? Are we tracking when we make a change in our detections? Is that an opportunity there? How would we do that? I understand that's a burdensome issue, or it could be. But if we are tracking our detections, that might help us in our return on investment conversations with our leadership. Because we can say, hey, we implemented this detection, and then we saw a spike in adversary activity associated with that technique. There is a high likelihood that that activity was occurring before, and we weren't detecting it. So now we have that return on investment opportunity to explain and show, hey, we're helping. In the same vein, if we're tracking our detections and we see adversary activity fall off, and we're like, all right, did we make a change in our detections that broke it? All right, then we can fix it. Or alternatively, is that a sign that adversaries have found a way of evading our detections? So then we have even better insight into what our adversaries are doing because we know what we are doing. It was something I definitely wasn't expecting coming into this, and I thought was really interesting to find. So here's a graph of our year by year. I know it's really small and hard to see. Again, there's in the report, but I'll kind of talk through. So when we break out our techniques year over year, and this data was normalized because obviously we had a partial year for 2019, a partial year for 2021, and the full year of 2020. So for this, we normalized it by technique per day count, just to get some evenness. And we were able to see on the left side, that's scheduled task job, our top technique, we saw it increasing. All right, is that adversary increasing, or is that adding new detections for that technique? I have no idea. But there are other points where I was like, okay, maybe this is the adversary. Ooh, we're seeing adversaries use a new technique. 1574, which is the hijack execution order, the third technique. I was like, wow, there was nothing of it in 2019, and then it spiked in 2021. That's a clear sign that like adversaries are like innovative technique. MITRE attack didn't include that technique until 2020. So again, there's that tracking your detections of I was all ready to be like, here, I have a clear thing of adversaries doing something, and I definitely don't. But doing this type of analysis was also interesting because when we look at the fourth and the fifth top, proxy and non-application layer protocol, we saw them both bottom out in 2021. And I was like, all right, I know for certain adversaries are still using proxy and non-application layer protocol. So to me, that was, are they evading our detections? I don't know for certain, maybe that could be. Is that maybe a question that when we look at doing sightings 2, we need to be prepared to engage with our contributors of, hey, any reason you're seeing this not happen? Because I know for certain adversaries are still using proxies in 2021. I think we can all say, yeah, no, they use those. So there was kind of that question, which then raises the kind of we learned a lot about detections, and doing a frequency analysis with your detections every once in a while might show where your sensors might need some refining, your detections might need some refining. Because when we did frequency analysis, there was a lot of, oh boy, how are we mapping and how are we tracking? But the big thing, we learned a lot about attackers. Well, we learned a little about attackers, but we learned a lot about defense. And one of the clear takeaways was try and start tracking your detections and when you're changing them.
So what are some things that we can do to get better in this area? The most obvious one is to have more data, which means more contributors. The more contributors we have, the higher fidelity our data is going to be. So we mentioned our specific contributors. We mentioned some of the biases. We're not exactly sure where their biases lay, if they have detections that are more tuned towards endpoint activity, towards scheduled tasks, towards network activity. The more data we get, if we turn that 6 million sightings we got into 100 million or a billion, then what kind of data are we going to have? Kellyn keeps asking a lot of questions that we don't really have the answers to, but if we increase that data set, we will be able to come up with some of those answers a little bit more clearly. We also need a regular auditing of our detections. As I mentioned, you need to know yourself. Those analytics that you wrote a while ago, a year or two ago, is it still doing what you think it's doing? We see a lot of heat maps. We get asked about heat maps all the time. I'm sure your bosses have asked for heat maps. And you see your heat map with attack, and you say, hey, here are all the defenses. They cover all of these techniques here. So these are all green. We're good. That map was made a year ago. Has that technique that was green a year ago, has it changed? Does it have a new sub-technique? If you're not regularly auditing your detections, you're not going to be able to know that information. And as we talked about earlier, teams are small, and that's hard to do. So maybe it's something you do quarterly or twice a year. Anything that you can start running some analytics on your own analytics, you can become a better defender. And we also want to create a public portal for data exploration. Kellyn mentioned Sightings 2. We're going to start research on that this fall. And one of our goals is to have a public portal where people can go and query and interact with the data. There's a lot of great researchers here out in the community that probably know a lot more things than we do. And so they might have new ideas. You might have new ideas on questions you can ask of the data. We want to make that a resource that's available for everybody to go to and perform some awesome research.
Yeah, because when we talk about the idea of, all right, we put out a report saying, like we said, okay, defenders lack visibility. We want to give them a day-to-day understanding of what adversaries are doing. And then we put out a monstrously long report talking about what techniques were observed a year ago. We recognize that that's not giving you day-to-day information. This was kind of our first notional attempt of what can we get with this data, what do we learn, and how do we make it better? And we've, from what we've heard and what we think, public portal for this data exploration is really one of those objectives we want to meet.
So how can we get involved? How can you guys get involved? If any of this seemed interesting to you, if you're someone who has data that you can contribute, we want to contribute, reach out to us. We're happy to talk about what that looks like, how you can improve the Sightings ecosystem. And also, you're just a researcher. Maybe you have some awesome ideas of how we can make this a little bit better. We'd love to hear your ideas. Everything we do, as I mentioned, is for the public community. It's all open source. And so whatever gets given to us, we want to give back to the community just to help cybersecurity around the world. You can send an email to the email that's on the screen, and with that...
You can talk to us. We will be around all week.
We'll be hanging out, so if you want to come up and ask some questions. With that, I think we'll
Thank
open
you
up for
all.
questions.
Any questions?
Oh, nice.
Ooh, we have questions. This is so exciting.
So exciting. Oh, yeah.
Is it on? No, it's not. Hello? Yeah.
Yep.
First of all, I'm really happy that it finally took off, right? I can remember Rich trying to get it started, and it now did, so that's excellent. I think one thing that I was missing, and I might have missed it, is detection quality and the amount of, and maybe to phrase that a little bit. So there's a couple of things there, that like false positive rates that probably are there, because a million sightings with a handful of contributors, I don't buy.
Yeah.
So that's one, and then that is also sort of tunnel vision now into the detections that they actually had, because if you look at the co-occurrence sheet, I would expect a lot more, right? So they're missing a lot of stuff. And that's not your fault, that's just all these providers. So that will be an interesting thing to maybe add to the next session, where you can review part of that detection to see how good the detections actually are, to value their contribution, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. That was something I definitely noticed. I think Mike is probably getting a little bit of deja vu at the moment of because there's also that question of how well does a detection cover a technique? Mm-hmm. What kind of coverage do we get? How good is it? It was just outside of the scope. We couldn't get to it this time, but definitely take note.
It would be cool to have more co-occurrences so you can start build Markov chains and so on, right? So
yes, exactly. And Markov chains, you're a little limited without the sequence per se, and just by having co-occurrence, it doesn't work as well. Okay, no. Sorry. But yeah, we recognize that. That co-occurrence graph, we also had a fairly high threshold for the association rule mining. There were more, but co-occurrence was extremely limited.
And as far as the data quality, we weren't able to validate the detections, but we did have a field that how did they validate the data? Was it machine validated? Was it raw, or was it human validated? And so that allowed us to give a little bit more confidence to the ones that were human validated, that this was a real alert, a real detection.
Cool. All right. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. I'm Eric Julian from Octa. Quick question between, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, but were you able to see a distinction between, I guess, commodity malware and like APT? I know commodity tends to happen a lot more often than APT, so I wasn't sure.
It was really just the techniques. We did ask for malware. We didn't get a lot of malware, and then we got just hashes and not names, which then doing the analysis with hashes didn't go super well, because would you believe a frequency analysis of hashes shows a lot of one-offs? Lesson learned there for us. But we didn't, I was looking for that APT versus commodity, and because a lot of those techniques, especially when we look at what ransomware actors are doing and what those Trojans are doing and some of the features they have, it was hard to see. For the APT, I did look closely at some of the outlier tail of the data, because we talk about the top 15 here, but there were 184 techniques in this data set. I couldn't pull any trends from that outlier tail, but it was definitely something we looked for.
For some of the contributors that gave us software, it was a lot of adware. And where do you draw the line between what's malware that's useful and what's just adware, what's freeware, what's junk? So that was hard. We eliminated all of those fields for this round. But that is something we want to improve. Attribution is absolutely something we want to look into as well.
Great, thanks a lot.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. So if I understood right, you based your analysis on analysis being done by other companies. Mm-hmm. So the question I was, did you take in consideration the different interpretations of MITRE attack one team could have that another could have on the same analysis? We've tried to do the same thing in France with a group of certs, and we've seen very, very different interpretation of the same analysis of a malware, and it was very astonishing to have this much differences.
Yeah, and as we kind of talked about earlier, mapping to attack is very difficult. We didn't have a good mechanism to account to make sure that if they marked it as command and script interpreter, that that's actually what it was. Our hope is in the future, as we get more data, those types of outliers will kind of, be washed away with the quality data. Did you have another take on that?
No, it was something that we really grappled with, but we didn't solve. Like, there was obviously that suspect of like, all right, we're pretty sure you're interpreting this differently than someone else. And there were some where it was like there were anomalous spikes of techniques, particularly if we like did a frequency analysis of like comparing our contributors. I was like, wait, okay, maybe this is something in the next iteration, because we know it now exists, that we can have like a kind of like norming and storming operation with our contributors of, hey, how are we doing this? But we didn't have an easy way to do that.
Thanks.
Thanks.
More questions?
Yes.
That's great.
I just had one, just on that last bit there. So with the next iteration, I mean, this is awesome. I like this idea of like starting to bring sightings across all these organizations together. On these contributors, I take it you didn't really understand what their visibility breadth might be. So one contributor could have like all their sightings coming from one source and another could not. Do you think that played into some of those spikes that you saw across different orgs? Or?
Again, we just didn't have that visibility. Like, we didn't build that in. Like, the first time we were like, let's just get data. And then we got the data and we went, right, maybe we should have talked more. But I mean, that's what the first time is for, right?
Yeah. We did have conversations with one technique in specific, user execution 1204, where there was a huge spike. So we reached out to the contributor and asked them to look into it. And this was at a time where they were tuning their sensors, so they were changing things with their product that made it where they were alerting really, really heavily on something that wasn't actually happening. And so when we do see these things and we start the normalization, we have the access to go reach out to them and have them look into those things. And that benefits us, obviously, research, but that also helps them. If we find something that they didn't notice, it helps them make their stuff better as well.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff.
Yeah. Thanks.
Further questions? No? Good. Then thanks the speaker again.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome.